why the city is crowded from day. The light is versus pride. Another crowd, the eyes of the shine. Break through the eyes, the curtains hide. You may deny the burdens, but we step trying to find the perfect vibe, the perfect cloud, the right place to come. I'm certain high and low like where is mine, but not the shine and throw the first. Body word inside. I'm so forgot that no one can do your heart. Don't you stop to tell what you hold with your legs, so with your neck, no subject on. We're not giving an answer. Beauty in the feet of the wise man, bring hope to a hungry soul. That you were dreaming. There's beauty in the heart of the woman, open arms to the lost and the poor, a homeless child. Said they weeping, shine a light to the thousand thirsty names. They crying out for something to believe, trying to work their way to find salvation. The signs of the beautiful. There was a man of water, and he spoke of the one to come, but for the one was hope and glory. So lighting up the hearts of the children, the hearts of the broken.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so thankful that each and every person who is with us today has chosen to take time out of your Saturday to join us. My name is Lakeisha Harrison, and I am the director of the ChristAfrican Theological Institute here at Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ. Welcome to our 2023 virtual Juneteenth conference. Our Juneteenth conference started in 2021 and has continued faithfully the last couple of years, continuing to grow and expand in no small part because of your participation with us. We have some people who have joined us each year, and we have some people who are new to CADI and to our conference. We are in a moment going to open up the chat briefly so that we can give people who are joining us an opportunity to let us know where you are joining us from, because we do not take for granted that you've taken time out to be with us. So we'd like to know where you are joining us from. So in a moment, the chat will be open to participants so that you can let us know your name, where you are joining us from, either your church, your institution, the country where you are, the state or city, whatever information you'd like to share to let us know who is in the room, because we are so grateful that you have joined us. We have an exciting conference this year, and we are so thankful that one of our keynote panelists today, our keynote speaker, is someone we have been working diligently to get involved in our Juneteenth conference since our first one in 2021. And finally, everything began to align this year for him to join us. That is none other than Dr. Michael A. Battle Sr. He is currently the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Tanzania. We are so thankful, and we will hear from him momentarily. But before we get to that, I want to make sure that I acknowledge the fact that our conference this year had two sessions originally scheduled for today. We were going to have a morning session that started at 10 a.m. Eastern, but unfortunately we had to cancel it. Our morning session was going to be a conversation with Mr. Michael Shirima. He is an entrepreneur and philanthropist from Tanzania, and he is the owner of Precision Airlines. It is the only solely private owned airline in the country of Tanzania. Unfortunately, he passed away a week ago. And so we had to cancel our morning session that we were going to have this morning in conversation with him about his memoir that he wrote called On My Father's Wings, that chronicles his life as a young adult to the present, his journey to entrepreneurship, his journey to starting the airline, and importantly for our purpose here, his journey to starting an orphanage at home in Tanzania that gave housing to nuns, who took care of the babies and the children at the orphanage that he started. So our conversation was going to be about his faith journey, how faith informed not only his business decisions, but his missionary work. And so even though we did not get a chance to have a conversation with Mr. Shirima this morning, we wanted to make sure we took time to honor and pay our respects to him this afternoon in our opening session, because as far as we are concerned, he is still a part of this conference. We are so thankful to his family for opening their hearts to us in communication. We have been in communication with the family, and we ask that you keep all of them and the country of Tanzania in your prayers. And so at this time, I would like to turn things over to our pastor of the Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ in order to open with a word of prayer for the conference and a word of prayerful remembrance for Mr. Michael Shirima.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison, and good afternoon to everyone. Let us look to the Lord in prayer. God of freedom, justice, and love, as our ancestors did at the news of emancipation, God, we come to celebrate your power and your promise that is never failing. We celebrate this weekend the promise that the arc of the moral universe is indeed long, but it always bends toward justice. This has been the message of Juneteenth. This has been the story of our people and how we give you thanks for including us in your story. Thank you, God, for the opportunity this afternoon to hear and to be fed by one of our nation's great diplomat, preacher, scholars. Thank you for his graciousness in being with us. We pray that you would continue to bless and anoint his life and work. God, touch all who hear this session, both live today and for posterity on social media. And indeed, we lift up the family of Michael Sharima, our ancestor now, a great humanitarian taken from our world too soon. Our world is all the poorer when visionaries like him leave this world. And we know that his family grieves now, but we ask on their behalf that you, God, in time will grant them peace which passes all understanding. We lift up these moments to you, God, even in this virtual space with thousands of miles between us. We acknowledge your presence is with us. Bless this global conversation, we pray. In your many names, we ask it all. Amen and Ashe.
Thank you, Pastor, for that. And we would like to share an image, a slide that we have prepared in remembrance of Mr. Sharima so that everyone can see his face if you are not familiar with who he is, and the cover of his book. And I believe in the chat we have shared some information about where you can find more about him, his airline, his orphanage, and the book. We will be sharing those links in the chat so that you can see what those are. And this is Mr. Michael Sharima, who was to be our 10 a.m. speaker this morning. Please familiarize yourself with who he is. He is a wonderful man. I had the opportunity to speak with him and moderate a conversation about his memoir earlier in April, which is what prompted me to invite him to be a part of our Juneteenth conference today. So it is very enriching. The book is very enriching, and not just in terms of a story about a person's life and his journey, but it is very enriching from a place of faith. So thank you for that. I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Robin Aparicio, who is going to provide an introduction of our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Harrison. I have the privilege of introducing everyone to our speakers for this afternoon. We begin first with Dr. Harrison. As she indicated, she is the director of the ChristAfrican Theological Institute, CATI, of Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ, and the co-creator of the Lecture Lounge, excuse me, a quarterly CATI Salon series to bring the community and the academy together in dialogue about faith, life, and social issues. Dr. Harrison was ordained by Covenant Baptist UCC in 2018. Dr. Harrison brings to her roles at Covenant an extensive background in international affairs and religion. She holds a PhD in African Studies and graduate certificate in international studies from Howard University Graduate School. Her PhD concentration was in religion, and she conducted her country research in South Africa on the intersections of religion, gender, and law. She also holds a Master's of Arts in Religious Studies and graduate certificate in Women's Studies from Howard University School of Divinity, with a concentration in African and African American Christianity. Her master's thesis examined the intersection of religion, gender, law, and race in the United States. She is currently the Assistant Dean of Student Services and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, where she is also a professional lecturer in the Institute of African Studies. She has also earned a Juris Doctorate from Howard University School of Law. She is a member in good standing of the bar in both New York and Michigan, and has worked for over 15 years in the environmental and energy fields. Dr. Harrison, in her free time, wink, wink, is also a producer and programmer with the Sophie's Parlor Women's Radio Collective at WPFW 89.3 FM. Now to our keynote speaker, Mr. A. Battles, U.S. Ambassador confirmed to the United Republic of Tanzania. On August the 20th, 2021, President Biden announced his intention to nominate Dr. Michael Anthony Battle Sr. as ambassador to Tanzania. Battle took his official oath for the office on December the 21st. He has a distinguished career of public service spanning 4 decades as a diplomat, in academia, in the faith community, and as a military chaplain. Battle was executive vice president and provost at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. He served as a senior advisor to the Bureau of African Affairs at the U.S. Department of State for the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit in 2014. He also was the U.S. representative to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the U.S. ambassador to the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Earlier in his career, Battle's positions included service as the president of the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and chair of the Robert W. Woodruff Library of the Atlanta University. He served for 20 years as a chaplain in the U.S. Army Reserve, retiring with the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1997. Battle has held senior academic administrative positions at Chicago State University, Virginia State University, and Hampton University. And he participated as an election observer in 1994 for the first free election in South Africa. Battle has authored numerous books and publications on topics related to ecumenism and the Black Church. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Trinity College, a Master's of Divinity from Duke University, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Howard University. Hear ye both of them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Aparicio. And welcome, 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 Ambassador Battle.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you finally after 3 years of trying.
Yes, the third time is always the charm. And I can say that I am absolutely tickled to have you. I am so thankful for the way God has blessed me in my life that our paths have crossed because you did not have to take that unsolicited request from me to have a conversation and connect. This is the power of informational interviews at work right here. And it has been a pleasure over the last 3 years to watch your work in the field of diplomacy and to be reappointed again by the Biden-Harris administration to a second ambassadorship. That doesn't happen all the time in the world of diplomacy, for people to receive multiple ambassadorship appointments. It does happen sometimes, but it does not happen that often. So we are so pleased by your accomplishments, and considering your busy schedule, we are absolutely delighted that you were able to take time to be with us this year for our Juneteenth virtual conference. Now, Dr. Aparicio has provided us with your background and your bio, so I'm not going to belabor the point because I could just sit here and gush. I saw our pastor, rooting and cheering back there while she was reading your bio. So I'm going to give you the floor now to provide us some opening remarks. Our theme this year is from Southeast to Southeast, from DC to Tanzania, connecting across continents through faith. Can you give us some opening remarks around that theme and to help set some context for how and why people of African descent in the US and people of African descent on the continent of Africa have things in common that can bridge us and bring us together, and how faith plays a role in that?
Well, first, let me express deep gratitude to you and to your pastor and the staff of both the church and the Institute for having sponsored this wonderful conference celebrating Juneteenth. I want to start by sharing briefly that earlier this week, I was at the White House for the very first celebration of Juneteenth ever on the lawn of the White House. The fact that Jennifer Hudson was the headliner made it quite significant. But for me, what made it also very significant was the fact that Hampton University's choir was featured as the choir to provide the music for that occasion. It is interesting that a president would host an event like that on the White House lawn to celebrate the recognition of the nation that Juneteenth is a significant holiday, not only in the lives of African Americans, but in the life of this nation as a whole. It is not to be compartmentalized with exclusivity as a Black holiday. It is a national holiday where the nation comes together to focus on its own history and how the history of African Americans is interwoven with the history of the United States of America. So it is America's recognition that freedom came to us as a people a whole lot later than freedom came to other Americans. And for the nation to acknowledge and celebrate that is something that we need to pay close attention to. It was mentioned earlier in my background that one of the things that I did, other than my work as a theologian at ITC and as a military chaplain, is that I served as the executive vice president and provost of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. And just a little context for that, the Freedom Center in Ohio is the only major national museum that is a part of the Smithsonian Institute's museum system that is dedicated exclusively to look at the question of slavery and the question of freedom. And we celebrate the transition of African Americans and the struggle through the Underground Railroad, and how freedom eventually became our reality. And simultaneously, 50% of the museum focuses on the question of modern day slavery. Unfortunately, many people in the American context and many other parts of the world fail to recognize that today, in 2023, there are more people in different forms of slavery than were enslaved in the transatlantic slavery enterprise. That does not minimize the horror of the transatlantic slave trade. What it does do is say that we need to have a consciousness of the need for freedom of young men and women who are trafficked throughout the world in sex trafficking as a part of modern day slavery. But beyond sex trafficking as a part of modern day slavery, there's also a host of people across the world who are forced into servitude, into domestic servitude, working without pay, working without any consideration, and working in a state of bondage. And unfortunately, that bondage still happens on the African continent, where people are trafficked from Ethiopia and Eritrea through Sudan to Egypt and to other parts of the Middle East. Modern day slavery is a horrible story. The transatlantic slave trade is a horrible story. There's no justification whatsoever, theologically, politically, morally, economically, no contextual justification for slavery, none whatsoever. And we have to acknowledge that. Now, there is a bifurcation, unfortunately, in the Christian church, in that much of the white Christian church focuses almost exclusively on the question of modern day slavery and raise the issue politically and theologically, and justifiably so, that modern day slavery needs to be dealt with. But many of those same Christian leaders who address modern day slavery have a blind eye to the realities of the horror of American slavery that existed for our ancestors. And they tend not to focus on that. Now, the other side of that bifurcation is that most of the African American church focus, justifiably so, on the history of African American slavery. But they do not focus on the fact that modern day slavery is horrible, sinful, disgraceful, distasteful, wrong in every category. A few years ago at the Freedom Center, we brought together with Andrew Young, former Ambassador Andrew Young, good friend of mine in the city of Atlanta now. We brought Andrew Young to the Freedom Center to talk about the issues of American slavery and the issues of modern day slavery. And we brought together leaders of the white evangelical church, leaders of the African American church tradition, just to have a discussion about the different points of focus when we deal with the question of enslavement. And the interesting thing for me was how the eyes were opened by some of the white evangelicals who had never paid much attention to the story of American slavery, and simultaneously how the eyes were opened within some of the African American church leaders who discovered that the same way our heart bleeds and pains over the question of American slavery, our heart should bleed and pain over the number of young women and young men internationally who are trapped in a kind of modern day slavery that makes their lives miserable and subjects them to sexual exploitation and other kinds of exploitation. And what grew out of that was an emergence of a conclusion that each entity is legitimately interested in human freedom, but that each entity needs to expand its definitions and appreciation of human freedom and its definitions and appreciation of human suffering. Now, what I hope to have happened from that, wasn't able to continue to track it because I then went back into the area of diplomacy as I'm doing now. But my hope is that the Black church and the white church and every other element of Christianity will join in a common conversation. And that common conversation would be that if Jesus came to set free the captives, he came to set free all captives without regard to their race, their gender, their history, their ethnicity, or any of the other kinds of artificial lines of demarcation that tends to separate people. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depends on one's context. I've had the privilege of being on the west coast of Africa and seeing the points of demarcation from which African Americans were taken from the continent and subjected into slavery in the Americas. And I've also had the opportunity to go to Zanzibar, the island of the United Republic of Tanzania, and to be present, to walk in this spot of the slave dungeons where our brothers and sisters from the east coast of Africa were enslaved. And instead of being taken to America, they were taken to India and to other parts of Asia, and some to the Middle East, and also some to Europe. So you had slaves taken from the east coast of Africa to Europe, slaves taken from the west coast of Africa to both Europe and the US, but the slaves from the east coast also went to India and other parts of Asia. Too often, African Americans, we focus only on the west coast slave trade, and we do not focus very much on the east coast slave trade. A few years ago, I was in Kenya participating in a discussion with the All Africa Council of Churches, and a young Ghanaian diplomat raised a question of me, and he said to me, why is it that the U.S. has not apologized for slavery? Well, the U.S. has done it a number of times in a number of different presidents. But then I raised the question of him. I said, interestingly enough, because of the DNA testing, I know that my family comes from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. And I said to him, I said, there is an element of responsibility when it comes to slavery that we do not talk about, but we should talk about. And that is the part of complicity, or the part of some of our own brothers and sisters in the slave trade. So I said to him, I said, now, while America is apologizing, there also needs to be not an apology, but an acknowledgement that had it not been for the fact that someone in Ghana felt my ancestors more worthy of being sold into slavery, I may have been the Ghanaian ambassador to the United States of America, as opposed to the United States ambassador at that time to the African Union. And I also pointed out to him, as I have pointed out to Jerry Rawlings, former president of Ghana, who was a very dear friend of mine. So Jerry understood what I said. I said, Jerry, you and I are probably cousins, because if you look at Jerry Rawlings and you look at me, there's nowhere in the world we were not related in terms of our ancestry. So I said, had my family been allowed to stay in Ghana, I might have been the president of Ghana, who knows? But the reality is that slave trade is something that we need to be open, free, and honest about in terms of our conversations. Thankful for freedom, recognizing the responsibility to set other people free, and recognizing the obligation never, ever, ever, ever to allow for complacency, but to always remember that until every human being on the face of the earth is absolutely and completely free, none of us are absolutely and completely free.
I think you just dropped the mic. And that reminds me of a song, None of Us Are Free. If one of us is chained, none of us are free. I used to sing that in the DC labor chorus, and it was one of my favorite songs when talking about these issues of freedom. So thank you for those opening remarks and setting the context of how this day of Juneteenth that we celebrate here in the United States, that African Americans who were newly freed from the bondage of slavery started in Texas and continued through generations to celebrate freedom, and that it is important for us not to get lost in celebrating our own freedom while there are other people, including people of African descent, who are still not free today. Now, I want to kind of pick up where you ended with my first question. And for those who are participating, we're going to go through a set of moderated questions with the ambassador, and then we'll open it up towards the end for questions from participants. But I want to start on this issue of diplomacy and faith. Right? Because you started talking about some of your diplomatic interactions, and in particular conversations you had when you were the former ambassador to the African Union. We have a mix of people here on the line, some who are African experts ourselves, including Mr. Mel Foote, who has joined us, one of our keynote speakers from 2021, whom you introduced us to. But we also have some people on the line who don't know very much about the African continent. So first, if you could explain a little bit about what the African Union is, just a little bit, because we don't need to go into a full discourse on African political structures, but then talk about the role that faith has played in your career as a diplomat on the African continent. Because within that role as the UN ambassador to the African Union, you got to travel the entire continent and meet with leaders of various African countries. Could you talk a little bit about how faith informed your diplomacy and how their faith, the faith of the people you encountered in leadership on the African continent, informed their diplomacy towards the US?
Okay. To begin with a brief statement about the African Union. The African Union grew out of what was originally called the OAU, the Organization of African Union, where the countries on the African continent came together and made a determination that in order for the African continent to survive, there needed to be a greater sense of connectivity among African nations themselves. And part of it had to do with the fact that African countries were beginning to fight for their own freedom and their independence, breaking away from the old colonial ties that held them bound to European nations that had taken over the African continent. So the African Union in itself is a body of freedom. There are three principal multilateral organizations on the African continent, much more than three, but three principal ones: the African Union, the UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank. I have the opportunity of being the ambassador to the African Union and also the US rep to the UNECA. And because I was the co-chair of the AUPG, which is the African Union Partners Group, I also worked very collaboratively with the Secretariat of the African Development Bank. So I worked with all three of those multilateral Pan-African organizations that focused on African Union. So the African Union is divided into a number of regional economic communities. Many of them are geographically defined. Now, the most wonderful thing for me is that the African Union has determined that in addition to the 5 geographical regions, the North, South, East, West, and Central, that the African diaspora in America, in the Caribbean, in Europe, and all over the world constitutes the 6th region of the African Union. So all of us are a part of the African Union in that 6th region, which encompasses the diaspora. You know, the very first speech I ever made about African policy was stimulated by my faith and my commitment in the legitimacy of all humanity. Now, just to go back historically, that first speech was made when I was a junior in high school at Sodan High School in St. Louis, Missouri. I was a member of the Model United Nations. And just to show how long ago it was, Rhodesia was the nation. Ian Smith was the president of Rhodesia. And this was before Zimbabwe ever came into being. And Ian Smith had instituted a policy, or attempted to institute a policy in Rhodesia, where every African woman after the first child was forced into medical sterilization to prevent African women from having more than one child. So here I am as a 16, 17-year-old high school student on the floor of the Model United Nations, challenging Ian Smith's government's approach. And I was bold and courageous enough to say that Ian Smith and his government was immoral, unethical, wrong, and I used a lot of other terms as well. But the point was that that's what solidified my Afrocentricity and my desire to focus on the African continent, looking at the horrors that were happening with Ian Smith. And then much, much, much later, being able to be in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was elected as the first president of South Africa. And interestingly enough, in South Africa, I met F.W. de Klerk, who was the white president of South Africa. And I said to him on the day of, well, the election was multiple days, but on one of those days, I said to him, Mr. de Klerk, do you expect to win today? And he said to me, he said, look, he said, well, you know, every politician wants to win, but my only interest is that there are free and fair elections in South Africa, which for me signaled that he legitimately wanted Nelson Mandela to win. And then I had the opportunity to meet with Nelson Mandela as well. Andrew Young has always been a role model in the sense that Andrew is a United Church of Christ pastor and minister who served as an ambassador. Jim Laney, who was the dean of Cantler Theological Seminary here in Atlanta and was also president of Emory University at one time, also was a United States ambassador to South Korea. Charles Stith, who is a United Methodist minister, was the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania during the time of President Clinton. So there are a number of people who have been a clergy and who are clergy who served as U.S. ambassadors. Now, just a side note about Charles Stith. Charles and I were in high school at the same time at Sodan High School. I don't know of any other high school in the United States of America that can boast about the fact that it has had 2 people to serve as U.S. ambassador to the same nation. And now this is not a rich, preppy, private high school. This is a public intercity high school in St. Louis that has produced 2 ambassadors to Tanzania. And interestingly enough, both were ministers. And later in life, of course, Charles went to the Interdenominational Theological Center, ITC, in Atlanta, where he did his theological training. Much later, I became president of ITC in Atlanta, so our lives kept changing. So Andrew said to me, when I asked him the question, how do you cross the bridge of being a theologian serving in a diplomatic position? Andy said, everywhere you go in life, if you are called to ministry, no matter what your context is, that context, in a sense, is a congregation. It is a group of people assembled together. And your responsibility is to serve that group of people assembled together and to serve them with dignity, with integrity, with honesty, and to serve them with the best of the abilities that you have. And that's what I do as an ambassador. I serve with the best that God gives me, recognizing the humanity of everyone I come across and everyone that I'm obligated to make sure that I provide an opportunity for growth. So there is a theological sense that sort of permeates everything I do because I am a theologian. The fact that I'm serving as an ambassador does not nullify the fact that I am academically a theologian, and I am by choice a person who is committed to the concept and the notion that everything that I do and I'm a part of, there is an ontological context. There's a context that says that I am obligated to my belief that God gives me life and God gives me responsibility and obligation, and I'm obligated to make sure that I'm faithful and truthful to God as I'm faithful and truthful to my mission diplomatically. So, if I were a bus driver, I would drive that bus in absolute commitment to my faith and commitment in the God who gave me the strength to drive that bus and woke me up that morning to drive the bus. The fact that I am an ambassador in a position other than being a bus driver, I take the same kind of philosophical position. I am who I am and what I am by the grace of God. So at the end of the day, my obligation is always to honor the grace of God and not to cheapen the grace of God by irresponsibility.
Thank you so much for that. And it reminds me actually a bit of our first conversation when I told you that I was ordained and in the field of international affairs, and I asked you about that combination, and I said, it's not. I said it's kind of rare, and you were very quick to say, nope, it's not as rare as you think. It's just that not everyone is out about the fact that they are ordained or that they are ministers, but that the combination, the number of people with theological or ministerial backgrounds engaged in international diplomacy is higher than one might realize. And that you said it's been your part of your ethos in the world of diplomacy to also surround yourself with people who have that combination as part of those within your control, those who you work with, but also to continue to seek out mentors and relationship with those who have that combination.
Yeah. This whole question about faith of 3 weeks ago. Yeah, 3 weeks ago. As an ambassador, you have these huge houses, right? And you have a staff and all that kind of stuff. I hosted a dinner, and to that dinner, I had a Mennonite, a Mormon, the only Orthodox rabbi in all of Tanzania, leaders of the Islamic faith, a Catholic nun, a Catholic priest, and the papal enunciary. The papal enunciary is the ambassador from the Vatican. I had the leadership of the Lutheran Church, both the National Lutheran Church and the local Lutheran Church, a Hindu, a Baptist, and a Pentecostal, all at the same dinner table. And what I said to them, I said, look, I'm not hosting this dinner for political, so we can have a political discussion. But if politics comes up, then politics comes up, international politics. I said, but the reason I wanted to host this dinner is to show that collaboration, not just in an ecumenical context of people in the same faith, but collaboration beyond different faith contexts can bring more peace and stability. Tanzania, for example, 98% of the people in Zanzibar are Muslim, which means that in Tanzania as a whole, the United Republic of Tanzania, you probably have about a 60-40 relationship Christian Muslim. And then of course you have others who are from like animist religions, which are the traditional African religions, but the predominant faiths are Islam and Christianity. And because Tanzania made a conscious decision that it would not separate and divide people based on religious ideology, there is no strife between Christians and Muslims in Tanzania, as you have in some other parts of the world where Christians are fighting Muslims and Muslims are fighting Christians and all that kind of stuff. Nor do you have the kind of tribal conflict in Tanzania that you have in some other parts of the continent and some other parts of the world. And that was because of the intentional design of Julius Nyerere, who is the founder of the United Republic of Tanzania. His orientation was that the United Republic of Tanzania, the people of Tanzania, would live together, transcend their religious differences, transcend their ethnic differences, transcend their tribal differences, not ignore, because Nyerere was honest about the fact that everybody should acknowledge, accept their tribal distinction, but not to allow the tribal distinction to become a line of demarcation that prevents people from working collaboratively together. So my approach when it comes to diplomacy is to recognize the legitimacy of every different religious tradition. I noticed your pastor, when he prayed, he said something that most Christian preachers don't do, which means it evidenced the sense of broad interfaith ecumenism that he has. He said, and in the many names of God, do you know how powerful theologically that few state a worded sentence was? In the many names of God, which acknowledges that there are different people around the world whose approach to God is distinctly different from my approach to God, and that there is legitimacy in the multiple approaches to God. I thought that was, I wish I could pat your pastor on the back. That was exceedingly broad. It was remarkably theologically rich. And it represented the fact that God, who is known by many different names, by many different people in many different places, that if we can recognize the legitimacy of other people's faith while never denying the legitimacy of our own faith, I think the world would be a whole lot better. So thank you, Pastor, for the broadness of your prayer.
Thank you so much for that, Pastor. Well, I'm calling you Pastor. Ambassador, you covered one of the things that I was going to ask you, and that was what can Tanzania, as an example of interfaith leadership, what many people I'm sure on the line don't realize is that Tanzania's current president is Muslim.
Yes, she is.
And
you know, here's the thing. This is a Muslim woman who wears her hijab. But on Ash Wednesday, she came out publicly and said, well, actually, she came out publicly and gave a better explanation of why people wore ashes on Ash Wednesday than many Christians gave. And then she called the nation to respect and honor the fact that on Ash Wednesday, people will be walking around with ashes on their head. Now, this is a Muslim president. That was nothing that required her to do that, but she did it because what she was trying to say was that while she was a Muslim represented by wearing a hijab, she understood that there were millions of people in her nation who are Christian, who never would wear a hijab, but on Ash Wednesday will wear ashes on their head. And she took the time to explain what all of that meant and to explain why people should respect people who they saw with ashes on their head. And I thought that was absolutely remarkable.
So I would be interested and curious to know a little bit about the topics of conversation that came up in your dinner. This interfaith dinner you held in Tanzania, and what it was you learned from these various clergy leaders in Tanzania who were sitting around at your dinner table about one another's faith, and about what conclusions or next steps you came to regarding how to move diplomacy forward and move the unification of people and respect of humanity forward, both in Tanzania, and how that's a lesson for us here in the United States, particularly African Americans and the African American church.
Well, one of the things that, of course, was verified was the fact that the peace and tranquility that Tanzania is experiencing because of intentionality, that people have intentionally decided to collaborate with each other. I mean, people are still trying to win other people over to their faith perspective. That's what people of faith do. And at the same time, there's a recognition that that we are all human, and that our humanity brings us together no matter what our religious traditions are. We also talked about some rather heavy issues, and we dealt with the crisis and the war in Sudan that is ripping one of the continent's large countries apart, where you have two generals in Sudan fighting each other, leading armies against each other, and people are dying in the streets of Sudan, and how the impact of that war is affecting South Sudan, Ethiopia, the whole Horn of Africa, and Eastern Africa, as well as Southern Africa. We talked briefly about the struggles in Ethiopia and how the tensions in Ethiopia are ripping the nation and the continent apart. So we talked about some rather heavy political issues, international issues, as well as questions about faith and tradition. We talked about what it's like to be community absorbed, to have a commitment to one's community, and defining community as more than just your local neighborhood, but the community of people in the nation, and the community of people on the continent, and then the community of people in the world. So those levels of conversation. And what one interesting thing was when the Orthodox rabbi was making an intervention, and in formal diplomatic circles, when you make a speech, it's called an intervention. So he was making an intervention about how he was received when he first arrived in Tanzania, and how some of the traditions that he has are new traditions in Tanzania, because there's not a large Jewish community at all in Tanzania, but he was sent by his faith to try to see if he could find enough people to start a temple in Tanzania. And hopefully he will. And he was talking about what he learned as a rabbi coming for the first time to a place like Tanzania. You know, Tanzania is about the sixth largest in terms of population. There are 61 million people in Tanzania. It's located right on the Indian Ocean. It has a very thriving series of ports. Just recently, I was at a celebration when Boeing aircraft delivered the first large cargo plane to be a part of the Tanzanian airline. And Tanzania has bought a number of passenger planes that will be delivered by Boeing, and which gives Tanzania now the capacity not only to trade internationally by its sea routes, which it already is masterfully able to do so, but now to be able to trade internationally by being able to fly cargo on its own aircraft internationally. Just one other side point about the independence and the sense of ownership that Tanzanians have. The president of Tanzania dedicated about a month, well, less than a month ago, and I was there in Dodoma, which is the actual capital of Tanzania, the new state house. Now, they built a state house in Dodoma, which exactly replicates the state house that was built during the time that the British had Tanzania as a protectorate. And the president of Tanzania said, now, this new state house was built completely with Tanzanian money. Everybody who worked on the project were Tanzanian. They had no external money and no external construction. It was totally done for and by Tanzanians themselves. And the amount of pride that was taken in that, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm trying to get more American industry to see the need to invest in Tanzania and to invest in other parts of the African continent, because the only way the African continent is going to be fully liberated is if the African continent can produce value-added productivity from its own raw material and resources, as opposed to its resources being taken from Tanzania and other parts of Africa, manufactured in China or in the US or in Europe, and then brought back and sold to Tanzania. We're trying to create an industrial base, a productivity base in Tanzania itself, which would accelerate Tanzania's economic freedom as well as its political freedom.
Thank you for that, because there are a number of people on the line who don't necessarily know those facts about Tanzania and that history about Tanzania. And I'd like for you to expand a little bit to help us. Our theme is from Southeast to Southeast, from DC to Tanzania. And as you are familiar, Southeast DC is predominantly African American in Washington, D.C. That is where our church is located. It is located in the heart of Southeast D.C. And Tanzania is on the southeastern part of the African continent. So what are some things that we might not know that we have in common as African Americans right here in Southeast DC to our brothers and sisters in Tanzania? What are some things that we might not realize we share as people simply because we don't have the opportunity to interact with one another very often?
Well, you know, one of the things that is so absolutely visibly shared with people from Southeast DC and people in Tanzania and in most of the rest of the African continent is that there is an entrepreneurial spirit among Tanzanians and among people in Southeast DC, where there is a desire among people to create opportunities, to create jobs, to create businesses, and to a deep desire for peace and harmony. You know, President Obama used to say often that every parent on planet Earth wants the same things for their children. They want people to grow up healthy, grow up in peace and security, grow up in a comfortable surrounding, have enough to eat, have a sense of security. People in Tanzania, people in Southeast DC, people in the South Side of Chicago, people in Compton in California, people on the Bayou, people in Mississippi, it doesn't matter where you're from. Our humanity, our common humanity binds us together. I would love to see some very intentional efforts on the part of residents and businesses from Southeast DC to come to Tanzania and to explore for themselves firsthand experience of what it's like to be in a southeastern part of the African continent. That's why Tanzania is both a part of the EAC, which is the rec of all of the regional economic community of all of the East African countries, but it is also a part of SADC, which is the regional economic community representing all of Southern Africa. So Tanzania is both in the EAC and in SADC because it understands that it is both South and it is East. And it recognizes and celebrates that, and it refuses to only be East, and it refuses to only be South, because it is both South and it is both East. And the headquarters of the EAC is in, oh, by the way, I didn't mention that I'm also the US representative to the EAC, in addition to being bilaterally the US ambassador to Tanzania. I'm multilaterally the US rep to the EAC, just as when I was in Ethiopia, I was bilaterally the ambassador to the African Union, and also multilaterally in the International Bureau to the UNECA. So I've always had what is called a dual-hatted ambassadorial assignment, where I had a bilateral element and a multilateral element simultaneously. So that's what I'm doing. So, you know, and then too, the people in Southeast DC are beautiful people. People in Tanzania are beautiful people. So you have beautiful, vibrant, energetic, exciting, creative, entrepreneurial, creative people in DC, and you have the same in Tanzania. Interestingly enough, there's an African-American woman who's the mayor of DC. There's an African woman who's the president of Tanzania. Well, the Speaker of the House is a woman in Tanzania. The foreign minister is a woman in Tanzania. And up until recently, the defense minister was a woman in Tanzania. And you have women in political positions in the parliament throughout all of Tanzania.
That sounds like something we can learn from here in the US in particular, about the importance of increasing the number of women in official roles in government and leadership. It's the irony is not lost on me that many African countries are well beyond the US in terms of political representation of women in leadership positions.
Absolutely.
Many African countries have already, including Tanzania, have already had a female president, whereas the US still has yet to have one. We are thankful that Kamala Harris is the vice president of the United States, but we have yet to realize having a woman as the president of the United States. We are on our way there, but in that regard, it is my pleasure to point out that we are behind the African continent in being able to name that as an achievement for our country and something that we can learn from the African continent.
You know, it's interesting. If you look at the configuration of the African Union, right? The African Union by statute requires that you have women representation in the commissions of the African Union. You have the commissioner, and then you have about 8 commissions. It is a requirement that 50% are women. It's not an accident, it's a requirement. In Tanzania, it is a requirement that at least 35% of the parliament would be women. It's a requirement, it's not accidental. In Rwanda, I don't know if it's a requirement or not, but at one time, Rwanda had almost 50% of its parliament were women. And as you mentioned, there have been other African countries who have had women presidents, and there probably will be other women presidents elected in the next round of elections on the African continent. You know, people have the wrong view of Africa. People think that Africa is what is depicted on TV. Just like people think that all African Americans are what is depicted in some television shows that do not reflect our community. It is up to us as members of the 6th region of the African Union to make sure that we not only visit the African continent, but that we learn the true story of the African continent. We don't ignore its conflict because there are tremendous conflicts. There is tremendous poverty, there's war, there's strife, and at the same time, there is productivity, there's prosperity, there's peace, there's harmony, there is all of the juxtaposition of paradox. Just as there is in New York City, there is the juxtaposition of paradox. You can go from exceptional wealth to exceptional poverty in 3 blocks in New York City. And you can do the same thing on the African continent. My effort is to make sure that we lift the African continent where African nations can get into a status of not being dependent on aid and development, but being equal strategic partners in trade and investment. That's the orientation of the administration, and that's my orientation, and it has always been.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you one last question or two before we open things up. We have a number of questions that are making their way into the Q&A, so I want to make sure we leave enough time for those. But you mentioned conflict, and those of us who are outside of the African continent hear a lot about the conflict because that's what the media likes to focus on when it comes to the continent of Africa. It's conflict, corruption, disease, and disaster. Those are the main things we consume through the media that is presented to us about what the African continent is. Can you talk a little bit about what we hear regarding the role that religion plays in conflict on the continent versus what the reality is about the role religion plays in conflict? Because a lot of the times we hear that there's this conflict of what's happening between, you know, Muslim extremists or Christian extremists and those kinds of things. But that may be the case, and yet it may be a distortion of the reality. But it also does not account for the fact that religion and faith plays a role in peacemaking and peacekeeping on the continent. So can you talk about both sides?
Sure. You know, the unfortunate thing is that people tend to emphasize, and the press in particularly, to emphasize the instances where religion is divisive. And it is absolutely the case. We have to honestly acknowledge that in many cases, religion is divisive, where people will fight and kill each other based upon the differences of their faith, and where people will fight and kill each other based upon the distinctions of ideology, even though they have the same faith, where people are in the same major religion but have different ideological strands of that religion. But the 98% of places do not have the war and strife based on religion. But the places that do, those are the places that get all of the press, as opposed to people recognizing that if all of Africa were struggling over the question of faith, then all of Africa would be in turmoil. It's like I've often said to people, when you look at Christianity in the US, well, you know, you have elements of the Christian faith during the time of American slavery that supported, embraced, justified, and defended slavery. And at the same time, you had elements in the Christian faith that led the abolitionist movement that fought against slavery. And so we have to have a balanced approach, that we look at the war and strife and conflict, the disease and the disaster, as you said, recognize it exists where it exists, and then also focus on where there's peace and tranquility and where people are thriving and where people are prosperous, never losing sight of the fact that we have an obligation to help those who are in conflict and war and disease and disaster to get beyond the conflict, war, disease, and disaster. And that's what we do in American foreign policy. We are trying to implement peace talks in Sudan. We are leading the peace talks in Ethiopia. We were very active in the peace talks in the Central African Republic. We're working on peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we're working on peace everywhere there is discord on the continent. And at the same time, we're working on development where there is poverty and hunger and strife. We're trying to provide not just aid, but we're trying to provide mechanisms and training on agricultural techniques, agricultural modernization that increases the yield of farms where people are able to not only feed themselves. In fact, in September of this year, President Samia of Tanzania is hosting an international conference in Tanzania that will address the question of how to move from food insecurity to food security, where African nations which are blessed with arable land can receive assistance from the West and from other parts of the world on how to modernize farming so that Africa could not only be the breadbasket for itself, but Africa has the potential to be the breadbasket for much of the rest of the world. We just need to do our part in helping Africa's modernization. And we need to reject the notion, and I do this all the time. People say, well, no, you can't invest in Africa because if you invest in Africa, you have corruption and the risk tolerance is too high. Reality check. The risk tolerance in investing in parts in South Korea before South Korea became a modern country was higher than the risk tolerance is in the African continent. But there was a conscious decision made that investing in modernizing South Korea was worth it. I'm trying to get Americans and Europeans and the Japanese and South Korea and India and other parts of the world to see that investing in Africa now is an investment in the security of the future of planet Earth. Tell you why. 1 out of every 4 people on planet Earth in the next 20 years who would be under the age of 35 will be an African. That's 1/4 of the youth population of planet Earth is Africa. So the employment base for the world means we have to connect with Africa. God has already blessed Africa with the natural resources. You know, electric batteries cannot be made for Teslas or any other electric car without graphite and lithium. Most of the lithium and graphite on planet Earth is in Africa. You cannot create computer chips without cobalt. It's on the African continent. Nearly everything we need to survive in the next century, if God is kind enough to give us a next century, the resources are on the African continent. And interestingly enough, so is the youth population that's going to be necessary to fuel and drive the productivity. So we need to make sure that we're trying to train engineers and scientists and doctors and production people who are African on the African continent, as well as training people all over the rest of the world, because the globe is going to require it. There are too many African people on planet Earth to ignore. I was talking to a predominantly white group, and I said, you know, this was in Cincinnati, it was business leaders. I say, if you don't know an African, you need to make a point to go out and meet somebody and learn what it's like to talk to an African person. Because by the time your grandchildren are in the job market, inevitably, they're going to be working alongside somebody from the African continent. That's just the future of planet Earth.
That reminds me a bit about Reverend Dr. Jonathan Weaver, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
I know him quite well.
Yes, he was our afternoon speaker last year when we were talking about how to actually practice missionary work. And one of the questions I asked him is, what if you're outside of a major metropolitan area with a large Black population? How do you begin to engage in missionary work? And how do you begin to engage even the continent at all? And one of the things he said is, well, if you're out in Utah, there has to be an African association of some sort in Utah. Go find the association.
Absolutely.
Go seek out and learn and get to know people who are different from you. And that's the way you begin the process of getting to know who people really are beyond the stereotypes that we're presented with through media. Now,
absolutely.
I want to ask my personal final question of you that's related to what you said about the stereotypes regarding the African continent, that there is conflict is real. There are people who are look-alike or of the same religion, but have things in common, but that are fighting each other over ideological differences. That's similar to Southeast DC. In Southeast DC, it's a predominantly African-American population, and we have a lot of violence and conflict in our city, even directly surrounding our church, and we are actively working towards peace, but we are fighting one another and in conflict with one another. What are some lessons we can learn here in Southeast DC for how to bring peace to conflict in Southeast DC that international diplomacy on the African continent can teach us about how to be better diplomats within our own community?
Okay. I'm going to give some examples first in the U.S. and then to talk about the African context. Arthur Brazier, the Pentecostal bishop in Chicago, who pastored a very huge, well, it wasn't that huge then, but it was a moderate-sized church, Southside Chicago. Gangs were all over Southside Chicago. Fighting and strife, Black people killing Black people, Black on Black crime, all over Southside Chicago. Brazier determined that it was his responsibility as a leader of faith to find a way to engage with the young men and women who were killing each other. So he went outside of the church and started working, as your church, I'm sure, is doing, working in the community, side by side with people, trying to raise the question that development, growth, job opportunities, education opportunities would all be better in Southside Chicago as in Southeast DC if we could create an element of peace. Well, J. Alfred Smith out in Oakland, when he was at Allen Temple, I think was the name of the church, and I spoke from there. J. Alfred Smith did the same kind of thing in Oakland, dealing with the gang infested areas, decided to work with people. I have an uncle who was at one time, the national evangelist for the Church of God in Christ, Walter Battle. He passed away, unfortunately, many years ago. He was preaching once in St. Louis, right? And it was this church in downtown St. Louis. In fact, my father pastored the church, and there were a group of guys, shooting dice in front of the church. And my Uncle Walter came outside and he said, "Hey, brothers, what's going on?" And they were talking, and he said, "Look, let me play with you." And of course, he had on a clerical collar. And they said, "Oh, Reb, you don't mean that." He said, No, let me play. He said, "But before I do anything, I like to pray." So he got down on his knees in the rolling of the dice position and prayed with these guys. Nobody ever shot dice in front of that church again, ever. Why? I don't know. But they just never did. And so he would also go to many of the bars on New Year's Eve. And he would, say, look, and everybody knew him. So they thought he was crazy, but he wasn't crazy. He was just a person of faith. And he would say, "Look, I know you're going to celebrate all night long, but we're going to first have just 1 minute of prayer. All I want is 1 minute of prayer." But he built a relationship with people. Father Flager, was Roman Catholic, same thing, bringing people into the church. So we have a responsibility to the communities that surround our churches. We are lighthouses, right? Lighthouses lead people in out of darkness. It leads ships in, all people in out of darkness. We have to be lighthouses. Sometimes we are lighthouses because we go outside of our walls and we engage people and we set an example for people in the community, and we try to bring peace. A very large church in a community that is dying has a responsibility to revive the community. I don't care what the dying is about. If it's dying from sin, you have a responsibility to bring it back to life. If it's dying from corruption and gang violence, we have a responsibility to try to bring it back to life. Can these dry bones live? Not unless the church is engaged. We can't wait and say, "Okay, God, you have to come down and blow life into the dry bones." No, we are the life blowers. We are the ones responsible for creating new life in the dry bones. That's why churches exist in our communities. And so we just have to be bold enough and courageous. With the same thing on the African continent. Bold enough and brave enough to say that humans have an obligation to live side by side with people in peace when possible, because you have better prosperity and better health when people are living in peace and harmony with each other.
Thank you so much.
And to include people who choose not to believe in any God at all. There are people who choose on their own not to be religious. They choose not to believe in God. If they are hungry, we have no right to ask them first to confess Jesus Christ before we feed them. We have an obligation to feed them whether or not they ever confess Jesus Christ. Hopefully
You are speaking what our revival preacher preached on Thursday night.
Oh my.
He preached about the fact that people have the right to say no to your faith, to test it, to question it, because of the fact that they recognize there is an unknown when it comes to God. And if they don't believe what you believe is their answer to who God is, they have a right to say no. And we should have the ability to still engage with them and interact with them and to be in fellowship with them, even if they say no. And her point was, if we do that work, then when they say yes, it will be a real yes.
Absolutely. Amen to that.
Yes, yes, yes. So this is wonderful because you've just tied in our conference from last year and you've tied in our revival from this year all into the comments for today. And at this time, I am going to open it up to questions from our participants. We have a number of questions in the Q&A and a few that have been placed in the chat. And Dr. Robin Aparicio, who did the introductions, is going to read the questions in the order that they came through.
Yes, our first question is from Jeff Kennedy. What is Tanzania doing about its British eugenics-induced social order? The president of Rwanda said it took him 20 years to end eugenics-induced social order.
Well, Tanzania has a broader scope than just the British. At one time, parts of Tanzania were German influenced. And then that's in the Arusha section of Tanzania. And then you have other parts that were a British influence with being a British protectorate. And then you have the island of Zanzibar that was predominantly Arab influence. So you have the notion of a united republic that is dealing with social structures that grew out of a British modality, social structures that grew out of a German modality, social structures that grew out of an Arab modality. And all of those modalities are now finding their own way to define a Tanzanian definition, which of course Julius Nyerere offered when Nyerere was focused on how to look at a united republic of people who celebrated and shared their common Africanism, their common goals and desires for peace and connectivity. Now, it is the case that there still are not only social structures, but there are parliamentary structures that are very much like the British. For example, you have a parliament similar to the British parliament. There is now a Tanzanian woman who's a good friend of mine, Ambassador Mula Mula, who was also at one time the foreign minister of Tanzania. Ambassador Mula Mula is now the candidate, listen to this, to lead the secretariat of all of the British Commonwealth nations. The UK, Scotland, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean islands, and the African countries, all of the countries in the world that are part of the Commonwealth of Nations. In 2024, if Mula Mula is elected, we'll have an African woman leading the secretariat. I think that's a long way that Tanzania has come in trying to define itself in light of the complexities of what made it become what it is now, not just British, but German and Arab at the same time.
And Dr. Aparicio, before we go to the next question, I have to say that I too am familiar with Ambassador Mula Mula.
Oh, she's fantastic.
Yes, well, ambassador, she was the former Tanzanian ambassador to the United States, but also I can say that she is the reason I am at George Washington University. Teaching in the Institute for African Studies. They were looking for new African studies instructors. And our next question is going to come from Dr. Gia Cromer, who was connected with Dr. Ambassador Mula Mula. And I had an informational interview about my background to teach there with the ambassador. And from that interview, I was hired. Wow. And I am now teaching a course she originated called Women in Leadership in Africa. When she had to depart GW, when she was called back to be Minister of Foreign Affairs in Tanzania, that left a vacancy for teaching her course, which I took over and started teaching in the fall. So please give my regards to her.
I will. I see her quite often. I will tell her that I spoke with one of her mentees and that
Yes.
you are celebrating her tremendously.
Yes, because that was my entree to the George Washington
Oh.
University, and I would not be assistant dean now in that same school if it was not for that first meeting with her and Jennifer Cook. So
I'm going to send her a WhatsApp today.
okay, and please tell her to reach out to me. Send her my number as well, because we had each other's contact information, but then when she left, then we just kind of fell out of touch. So please do. All right, so go on, Dr. Aparicio, please. Next question
from Dr. Cromer. There are the horrors of chattel as well as modern slavery, the difficulties of learning and teaching about the complexities of Africa and how Africans have been treated, and difficulties in dealing with those in the current era who do not hear or acknowledge the difficulties of Africans worldwide. How do you maintain compassion as well as working relationships with and for those who do not acknowledge or support positive, self-determined outcomes for African countries and Africans in the diaspora? More succinctly, how do you refresh your faith for your work when the work is hard and attitudes are against you?
There are a couple of C's, the letter C, that I practice. One is, of course, compassion. Compassion for those who have not come as far in the journey as some others have in terms of understanding. Also, confrontation. There are times that I confront ignorance and confront complacency. I just try to confront it compassionately, because if you confront it in a non-compassionate way, you simply draw people further and further away. But if you confront them with compassion, eventually when their eyes are open, they'll come back around and have a conversation with you. And then there are times that I compete with what I consider to be some ignorance is not a classification of a person. Ignorance simply means absence of knowledge. So I'm not saying people are ignorant people. I'm saying people have elements where they don't know stuff, in that sense of ignorance. So I confront the ignorance and try to get people to understand that Africa has a long, rich history, and we need to celebrate it. And it also has a long history of trouble, and much of that trouble was infused, instigated, exacerbated by colonial influences. And we have to recognize that as well, but never lose the compassion. If you're walking alongside of somebody who totally, absolutely doesn't get it, you try to enlighten them. And if enlightenment doesn't work, you try to inform them. And if that doesn't work, at some point, you pray for them and you keep on going, because some folk are never going to wake up. And you spend your time with the people who are waking up, and that you could help in the waking up process. But don't ever, 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 ever get tired to the extent that you quit. Get tired and go and rest a moment, but then get right back on the battlefield.
Great. Next question is from Carolyn Brisbane. What is tourism like in Tanzania?
You know, the Zanzibar was rated as the most desired spot of tourism in the whole continent. The Zanzibar, the island of Tanzania. Arusha, for example, there is a cultural arts gallery in Arusha, and I happen to know the owner of that gallery. The largest collection of African art in sub-Saharan Africa is in Arusha. And he charges $0 for people to come into the gallery. There's no fee. Anybody can come into that gallery And when you come into that gallery, you're looking at artwork that sells for multiple millions of dollars. And then you're looking at artwork that is very inexpensive. And what he does is he brings together African artists, gives them a place to work and create their craft and to sell their craft. And they give a percentage to the museum, but the artisans get like 80% of whatever they sell, and the museum gets 20% of whatever is sold. But they don't pay for the space. They don't pay for the exposure. And people all over the world come to that gallery to view that artwork. It is absolutely stunning. And then you have, I mean, if you like safaris and you go to the Serengeti, which I've been able to do, and you are among the lions and the zebras and the other animals, it's like the movie Lion King. You're in the middle of Lion King when you're in a safari in Tanzania. So whatever you want to do, from beautiful beaches, climb Mount Kilimanjaro, to safaris, and lobster. You get so much lobster in Zanzibar that is like as common as a hamburger, but it is so delicious. But anyway, you need to, whoever asked that question, when you come to Tanzania, please reach out to the embassy. I love to meet you when you come.
I'm coming for the lobster.
I know that.
There you go. And make sure you get lobster thermidor, where you don't have to crack the shells. They've already taken the meat out, cooked it, then put it back into the shell, and all you need is your little fork and you just dig it out.
Oh, that sounds divine. I'm on my way. Okay, Dr. Aparicio, our next question.
Our next question is, Dr. Cromer, when the Hebrews left slavery in Egypt, some wanted to go back to the umbrella of Egypt rather than deal with the difficulties and responsibilities of freedom. Many of us in America want to get out of financial bondage to debt and loans, but find ourselves slipping back into old habits. How would the ambassador address issues surrounding descriptions of economic indebtedness and slavery of Tanzania to China and other non-Africans? Are there parallel warnings and or lessons between the Hebrews, African Americans, and Tanzanians?
Well, the simple answer to all their parallels, yes. How long it would take us to talk about the parallels? A long, long, long time. I do want to respond to the question about debt. Many African nations have discovered that what they thought was a good deal when China offered loans, they discovered was not a good deal, because when countries were unable to pay those loans, they ended up obligating much of their natural resources to Chinese control. African nations are now breaking away from that. Now, we bear some responsibility. I'm talking about we, meaning the US and the West. Because when African nations were asking for our investments and for us to be present, a lot of the West chose not to be present in the African continent. So I give this analogy. And in fact, it's an analogy that came from the president of Gabon. I was in conversation with him several years ago at the African Union. And President of Gabon said, when you're hungry, you don't care who feeds you. If you help us get to the point that we're no longer hungry, we will be more selective in terms of what we eat. So his point was that America needs to stop criticizing the African continent for accepting highways, roads, bridges, buildings, infrastructure built by China, unless we're going to come up to the plate and say, not only can we build it better, and our partners can build it better, it will last longer and will not put you in permanent debt. There are some deals that I'm working on now that I can't really talk about in this kind of open forum, but they are going to revolutionize how financing is done on the African continent, and how African nations would be able to have infrastructure without front-loading debt, which will break the cycle of dependency on external factors and will grow greater independence among African nations. My approach is we have to create wealth that stays on the continent. While some elements are being exported, much needs to be produced in value-added productivity on the continent that will create wealth on the continent. If we do that, I think the next century would be a much better place than the current century.
Thank you for that. I love that. I love that answer. Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. And thank you, Dr. Cromer, for that. And I should also recognize Dr. Cromer, who is a friend of Covenant. She helped pitch in during our conference last year as a volunteer. And she is also an Africanist and former member of the military. In particular, she was one of the original representatives to Nigeria when AFRICOM was stood up.
Oh, great. Fantastic.
Okay, next question, Dr. Aparicio.
Okay, this is from Pastor Young. The big news this week is the visit of several African leaders to the Ukraine. And while they are there, Russia does their dirty business and deploys rockets, a sign that Putin just doesn't care about the African presence there. But the South African president, Mr. Ramaphosa, demanded that the Russian war on Ukraine end. I thought that to be a powerful and significant sign of how important Africa is in maintaining peace in the world in the 21st century. Yet I cannot think of one nation in Africa that has nuclear weapons. What does that say to the current presence and future of people of African descent involved in global politics and diplomacy?
You know, one of the things that I think Africans recognize, and so do so many other parts of the world recognize, is that the proliferation of nuclear weapons at the end of the day doesn't do anybody any good. I don't know of any African nations that are even seeking to develop a nuclear weapon. African nations are seeking to develop nuclear power in order to generate electricity so that their countries can have a broader electric grid. They're seeking to develop hydroelectricity, sun and solar and all other kinds of electricity in order to have a wider power grid. It does say a lot about, in a very positive way, and I read about the African president. In fact, I knew before they went that they were going, incidentally, to Ukraine, and then they're following up to go to Russia as well. Africa, there was a slogan in the African Union that says African solutions to African problems, and for a long time that was the approach that the African Union took. When I was at the African Union, I would challenge that slogan. And I would say, well, now, it is true that we must find African solutions to African problems, but we cannot exclusively limit African solutions to African problems, because there is no problem that faces Africa that does not have global consequences. There is no problem that faces the global community that does not have African consequences. Contextualize that. When Putin invaded Ukraine, Ukraine produced so much wheat that was being sold on the world market. This war devastated the grain market worldwide. So African hunger increased because of the war in Ukraine. Liquefied natural gas. When this war broke out, much of Europe depends on liquefied natural gas coming from Ukraine. Now, here's a fortunate byproduct. Now, war is horrible. I'm ex-military. I understand that war is horrible. Horrible, horrible. War is horrible, without question. An interesting byproduct. A few weeks ago, Tanzania entered an agreement with a number of oil and gas producers worldwide, to include an American oil company. There will be a $42 billion project of liquefied natural gas coming from the coast of Tanzania, shipped from Tanzania to Europe and to the Middle East. So now Tanzania is going to be filling that gap, rather, of liquefied natural gas supplies. So Africans recognize that the war in Ukraine was a horrible invasion of sovereignty. I said on a TV broadcast in Tanzania about 2 months ago that Putin's desire to take over Ukraine, just because Ukraine at one point was a part of the Soviet Socialist Republic of the USSR, is just as horrifying as it would be if the British, which once held Tanzania as a protectorate, tried to come back and take Tanzania again, or if the Germans, who once dominated the Arusha area of Tanzania, decided they want to take Arusha, or if the Arabs, who at one time dominated Zanzibar, decided that they wanted to come and take Zanzibar again. So I said, it's a question of sovereignty. So African nations who defend territorial and geographical sovereignty need to stand against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was an absolute violation of national sovereignty. So I applaud, absolutely applaud, the African heads of state who are on an international journey. And you know what else is interesting? There is no continent on planet Earth with as many votes in the United Nations General Assembly as the African continent.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. And for our audience's context, who may not be familiar with the African continent, there are 54 countries on the continent. And that is how it is possible for the continent of Africa to have so many votes in the United Nations. It holds the most nation states.
Absolutely.
In a single landmass than any other landmass on the rest of the planet. Now, Ambassador, I am cognizant of the time. You have been so enthralling. It is 2:53.
Oh, my Lord.
7 minutes left, but we have 5 more questions that people want to ask you. I do not want to abuse the privilege of your time or the time of our hosts and those of us who are working here, but I will ask whether or not you have the time to go over by a few minutes, if that's possible.
Okay.
If not, then we can end.
Well, do this. Read all 5 of the questions, and then let me respond in a broad scope, and then we could wrap it up at about 10 after 3. Is that okay?
Thank you. Bless you. And then so that after your last answer, single broad stroke answer, we will then turn it over to our pastor to close things out. So those of you who are on the line, please stay with us. This conversation is so rich that it has just sparked a flurry of questions. And so Dr. Aparicio, I will also ask that you truncate the questions in case any of them are long.
Right.
And the sign of a true diplomat is to be able to take 5 questions and be able to answer them all in one single answer. So Dr. Aparicio, please synthesize, and then Ambassador Battle, please respond.
Okay. First question, is the U.S. taking a position on Germany's reparation to Tanzania? The second one is, if the media does not portray Africans accurately, why do people trust the same media to put, African Americans? Why do people trust the same media to portray Africans accurately? Can you address the educational system for the children of Tanzania? And 2 more. Is there a resistance to assist African nations to become economically independent? And then lastly, does Dr. Susan Johnson Cook, who was the Obama ambassador at large, is this position still viable?
That position is the international religious
Right.
ambassador at large for international religious relations. Is that position still viable, and how was it useful, or is it useful to your work? And I think that is the last question.
Yeah.
First, Susan Johnson Cook is a very good friend of mine, and I work very closely with her in that position. There is still someone in that position, and they produce, and I read all the time, their reports on the state of freedom of religion worldwide, and they do focus on freedom of religion in Africa. So yes, the position is very, very viable. With regard to the question about economic independence, one of the things that I'm trying to do, and a lot of other people are trying to do, is, and one of the reasons I was in Washington, every year, all of the ambassadors from the U.S. who are assigned all over the world come back together for what is called a Global Chief of Missions Conference. And that's what we just finished in Washington, D.C. And we are pushing that the strategy for the U.S. and the West is a strategy that will create economic independence and economic freedom in the African continent for 2 reasons. One, the West cannot continue to support in the sense of developing the continent exclusively. It's time now for us to help the continent become wealthy enough to develop itself and to create productivity itself. So for the first, not for the first time, but we are continuing the notion of African wealth and African independence to get more countries in Africa to become middle and upper middle class countries the way Botswana is now. Botswana is not dependent on anybody. Botswana creates its own wealth and is economically viable. Education. I speak of that because through our USAID program, we're assisting in African education. In fact, we have a program now that we are supporting, returning 45,000 high school dropouts back to school, giving them a choice either to do industrial education or to do traditional high school academic education. And so we're supporting education throughout the continent, and the continent has some very good academic institutions. The question about Germany, I don't know what's going on with Germany, and the question of reparations, I will have to learn more about that in order to speak about that. So I must apologize for not knowing enough about the question of German reparations in places like Arusha and other parts of the African continent. So I think I covered the questions, and I'm deeply appreciative for everybody who joined us in this. And now over to the pastor for his wrap-up comments.
Amen. Thank you so much. This has been incredible. Thank you to both of you. I too have a background, not like Dean Harrison, but I do have a background in international relations. So listening to this conversation this afternoon, for me at least, has been like geeking out again, as the kids would say. It is such a delight to have heard you, Dr. Battle. You have indeed connected for us Juneteenth with the motherland in ways that have brought special meaning and special emphasis to our commemoration this year. When I lived and pastored in the United Kingdom, I was privileged to serve as chair of an ecumenical task force against human trafficking, raising awareness to the churches throughout the country, on human trafficking, modern day slavery, and calling it as such. And so to hear you speak of the realities of modern slavery and how it's a continuation by and large of our ancestors' own suffering has been so very poignant to hear. So thank you so very much, Dr. Battle. If you've not done so, those of you who have been listening, please show your love in the chat to Dr. Battle. Thank him for this wonderful conversation. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't honor and give gratitude to Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Harrison, Reverend Dr. Dean Lakeisha Harrison, for guiding these last 2 hours. Again, as I've said all week, you have been uniquely suited to guide this conversation, and we're just so blessed to have you as part of the ministerial team here at Covenant, and keep on keeping on, my dear sister. And then, of course, thank you to all of the other organizers and volunteers who have lent their time and their talents today. Reverend Deborah Camphor, our church administrator, Reverend Lisa Dunson, Reverend Ray Doris Stewart, Minister Robin Aparicio, thank you for guiding the questions and introducing our speaker. And then in the background, way in the background, Dr. Kendall Wilson Dr. Kendall Wilson, our servant leader for worship and intercession. Thank you all so very much for your work this afternoon. Now I'm reminded again of our evangelist, Dr. Leslie Callahan from Philadelphia this week, preached so mightily. One of the many things she spoke about was being participants in our own liberation. That's God's desire for every one of us to be participants in our own liberation. And so in that wise, we do invite you, every single one of you, to be participants in this program and the continuing work of the ChristAfrican Institute and Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ. So if you have been inspired and enlightened in this lecture today, this conversation today, we invite you to use the QR code. I hope that the QR code will show up somehow, either on the chat as a link or on your screen. Use the QR code to make a donation to our efforts today, and you can indicate in the notes section of the e-giving Juneteenth conference. That's all you have to say, Juneteenth conference. And as we say at Covenant. If we give what we have, we will have what we need. And your giving ensures that we can continue to dream bigger. These have been some big ideas and very university quality series that we've had over the last 3 years. And you certainly shouldn't expect just to get that for free. And so we encourage you to use the QR code and to give gladly and not grudgingly toward the continuation of this conference and the other sessions, other events that ChristAfrican Institute holds throughout the year. The last thing that the director wanted me to tell you was that the other things that are going on, we continue our celebration of Juneteenth this weekend. Tomorrow is our Juneteenth service, as well as recognizing Father's Day, all of the fathers. So bring all your fathers, your baby daddies, everybody to worship on tomorrow. And it's a historic day in the life of Covenant as well, because our guest speaker, our preacher will be none other than our pastor emeritus, the Reverend Dr. Dennis W. Wiley, preaching back in that pulpit for the first time to preach since he retired. He and Christine Wiley retired in 2017. So it's been a long time, but we're so very excited to welcome him back to the Covenant pulpit. And then on Monday, if you live in the city, if you happen to live in the city, join us for the Juneteenth prayer breakfast, which is sponsored by the Ward 7 and 8 faith leaders of the Anacostia Coordinating Council. That event will be held in the Panorama Room at Our Lady of Perpetual Health Catholic Church at 10 a.m. on Monday, Juneteenth, the federal holiday, at least, of Juneteenth. So please join us for any and all or all of those events as we continue to celebrate our heritage and our future as a people together. We will not, and one last thing, actually, I do encourage you, I've already purchased my book, my copy, but I encourage you to go on Amazon and in memory of our brother, Michael Sharima, to purchase his book that Dr. Lakeisha talked about in the beginning, On My Father's Wings. It's online on Amazon. Let's support the family in that way by purchasing his work. We will not, I believe that's all, Dr. Harrison. We will, unless you have anything else that you would like to say.
I just want to say thank you for everyone for taking your time out to be here today on this Juneteenth weekend. There are a number of other places you could have been. Thank you to our international participants for logging in. And thank you, most importantly, Ambassador Battle, for taking time out to speak with us. It's been such a rich afternoon. I am full in all respects. My heart is full, my mind is full, and my spirit is full. I thank every single one of you for being a part of this conversation today. The work of CADI is not a work of one. The work of CADI is the work of many. And I am so thankful for everyone who has come together to make this conference possible this year. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone either in person tomorrow or on YouTube tomorrow for our worship service.
All right. And lastly, Dr. Rador Stewart is posting a link to a survey that we'd like for you to fill out. And so we ask that you click on that before we all log off, so that you can take that survey. It would help us out a great deal. We will say a final benediction at the close of service on tomorrow. But for now, we wish you well. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we will see you